Well, thank you all very, very much for inviting me, to the Dean, to Rebecca for the generous words of introduction. I'm going to begin with two stories. The first is set in Pointe-à-la-Hache in Louisiana, and the second in a small town in Appalachian, Pennsylvania. In Pointe-à-la-Hache, when I was researching my book on poverty, I met an oyster fisherman named Byron Ensalade. Byron was in his 50s. He was a self-made businessman, and at the peak of his business, he'd owned 5 ships, and he'd employed several people. And then Hurricane Katrina hit, and his boats were picked up by the waves and by the wind, and they were pushed off of the Gulf and over the levee and deposited on the streets behind the levee. Ensalade got some government assistance, but not much. Over the next few years, he clawed his way back. He rebuilt his boats, he used his trucks to generate secondary income, and he plowed his money back into rebuilding his fleet. He put the fleet back out, and they began catching oysters again. And then the BP oil spill hit, and his fleet was grounded. For months, they couldn't go fishing, and when finally they could, there were no oysters to be had. And when I met him in 2011, he was down to 1 ship, and he was barely making ends meet. All his economic security had vanished. And he said to me, "I've just had a conversation with my children, and I've told them there's no money for presents for the grandchildren this year at Christmas." More than 1,000 miles from him, in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, I met a woman of a similar age. Her name was Luanne Prokop, and she'd been an accountant, solidly middle class, earning about $50,000 to $60,000 a year. And then the recession hit, and in 2008, 2009, as jobs began hemorrhaging, she was called in by her employers and told she was laid off. Luanne spent the next 2.5 years looking for jobs, first in Pennsylvania, and when there were no jobs there, all around the country, and she could not find work. She burnt through her bank savings, she burnt through her retirement savings, she had to take her kids out of dance class and all the other perks. She went on to food stamps. She stopped eating 3 meals a day, and she began losing weight. And when I met her in 2011, she had finally found a new job. And the new job paid less than 1/3 of what the old job paid. She was working in a community center which doubled up as a food pantry. And it was lucky for her it was doubling up as a food pantry because she was now so poor that the only way she could feed her family was on charity foods. Now, Ensalade's story and Prokop's story are in one way very different. But in another way, they both speak to a common problem. The government responses to the crises that they were embedded in were deeply inadequate. When Hurricane Katrina hit, at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, the responses to people immiserated by that hurricane were slow, in some cases they were humiliating, and almost overwhelmingly they were inadequate. Similarly, when the financial crisis hit in 2008, when the housing market collapsed, when the credit systems of the country began drying up, and when employment began hemorrhaging jobs, again, the government responses were inadequate. Retirement savings evaporated overnight in many cases. Assets built up over decades evaporated overnight. And the government in many ways seemed unable to deal with the magnitude of the event. To take foreclosures, for example, as millions of families either lost their homes or became underwater on their mortgages and at imminent risk of losing their homes, there was no systematic and immediate intervention to try and keep those people in their houses. Now, collectively, these men, these women, and these children, whose stories I chronicled in my book, The American Way of Poverty, have bumped up against vast economic, and in the case of Hurricane Katrina, ecological forces, over which they have virtually no control. Forces that have made chronic insecurity for tens of millions of Americans the norm rather than the exception in the early 21st century economy. For these men, women, and children, they are on the wrong side of what the Yale political economist Jacob Hacker has termed the Great Risk Shift, a risk shift that in recent decades has placed an increasing risk for the cost of education, for the cost of healthcare, for the cost of retirement, and myriad other social phenomena onto the backs of individuals. And Hacker notes that the poorer one is in this economy, the more you face the burden of that new risk equilibrium. And there are an awful lot of poor people in 21st century America. By the government's own measure, nearly 50 million Americans, 1 in every 6 Americans, lives below the poverty line. And the government measure defining poverty is a very cautious one. It's 11,000 and change for an individual. It's 23,000 for a family of 4. If you use other measures developed by the Economic Policy Institute, various other progressive economic think tanks, somewhere in the region of 1 in 4, even upwards of 1 in 3 Americans on a daily basis is chronically economically insecure. That means they're juggling their bills. That means they're not sure what they would do if they missed a paycheck, or if they had an unexpected accident, or if their car broke down and needed expensive repairs. It means on a daily basis, insecurity rather than security has become their norm. For children, the data is even more stark. Nearly 1 in 4 American children, a higher percentage than any other industrial advanced democracy, nearly 1 in 4 American children lives below the poverty line. In the South, in many states, that number is now nearly 1 in 3. In some cities, in Detroit, in New Orleans, and in many other cities, 2 out of every 3 African-American kids under the age of 5 now lives in poverty. 6 million people literally live outside the cash economy. They have no jobs. They have no bank accounts. They have no retirement savings, and they have no cash assistance from the government. They live on the margins or outside the margins of a first world economy. When it comes to healthcare, even after the Affordable Care Act has begun to kick in, millions of people, especially in southern states that did not expand Medicaid, still remain excluded from regular and affordable healthcare access. We're frequently told that education is a panacea to many of these problems, that education is a pathway out of poverty and up into the middle classes. That may or it may not be true. What is undoubtedly true is that in recent years, American social mobility has largely ground to a halt. And not coincidentally, during these same years, quality public education has also arrived at a moment of crisis. In 2008, 2009, and 2010, billions of dollars of funds hemorrhaged from K-12 education systems all around the country. And even today, universities, higher education systems, have still not recovered the public investments that were lost over the last years. In the case of big university systems like the University of California and many other major public universities, what has happened instead is that students have been asked to bear an ever greater share of the tuition burden. And I come back to what I said a minute ago about the great risk shift. To be young and to have aspirations, to try to be upwardly mobile, and to do what you have been told you need to do to succeed, getting a higher education, nowadays involves accepting a tremendous amount of private financial risk. In April 2010, when I was doing some research around poverty and around the implications of rollbacks in public infrastructure, I met a group of educators in California who were recreating one of Cesar Chavez's great civil rights marches. 50 years ago, Chavez and his group of farm workers had marched up California's Central Valley, from Bakersfield north to the state capital of Sacramento, trying to highlight the conditions faced by impoverished farm workers. 50 years later, educators marched that same route, trying to highlight what it meant to impoverished communities when education, that most basic of public investments, was rolled back. And I walked with those marchers, and I interviewed them, and I interviewed people in the towns that they were going through. They were going through towns with Depression-era levels of unemployment. They were going through Central Valley towns in California with upwards of 25% unemployment. They were going through Central Valley towns where the housing values had imploded, in some cases by more than 60% in a few-month period in 2008-9. They were going through towns where entire communities were boarded up because of foreclosures. And they were going through towns where there were vague signs of development, but the developers had fled. And you could see street signs protruding from overgrown grass lots that in fantasy land had been turned into tract housing, but in reality had been left vacant at the start of the recession. And they were also staying the night in RV trailer parks, where people who used to own homes were now living in their cars. And they were getting up in the mornings, they were getting ready for work in the campground bathrooms, and then they were setting off for their jobs. Put simply, the mechanisms out of poverty and the systems that from 1940s, from the World War II period through to roughly the end of the 20th century, provided a degree of economic security for the middle classes. Those mechanisms and those systems have, if not ground to a halt, then at least entered a period of profound crisis. We think of ourselves as a country of mobility. We think of ourselves almost hardwired to be upwardly mobile and aspirational. It's a defining part of our history. Yet if one looks at social mobility data from the past 2.5 decades, one sees a very different story. One sees social mobility data that suggests we are much less socially mobile than we used to be as a country, and also that we are much less socially mobile than most of our peer nations are today. What that means is, if you were born into poverty in this country in the late 20th and early 21st century, you are far more likely to spend your life in poverty, and you are far more likely to die in poverty than you would be if you had been born into poverty in a peer nation, Canada, let's say, or Germany, or Japan. Conversely, if you were born rich in this country, you're born with that proverbial silver spoon in your mouth, you are much more likely to preserve your wealth and preserve your assets and hand those assets down intergenerationally than is the case in other countries. Both at the top and at the bottom, that social mobility has ossified. Meanwhile, in the middle, the downward pressures are getting more pronounced. We're seeing a skewing of the economy between the rich and the poor, and almost year in, year out, economic data suggesting pressures downwardly on those left in the middle. And this has huge implications, not just economic implications, huge policy implications for what kind of a society we are, and as importantly, what kind of a society we are becoming. Several years ago, before the 07-08 collapse, as a journalist, I got fascinated by the ignored and the hidden underside of the American economy, by a poverty that was being masqueraded by decent macroeconomic data, growing GDP, rising stock values, rising housing values, and actually fairly low unemployment, but that nevertheless was having a huge impact on individuals, by a poverty that was being masqueraded by people borrowing, going ever further into debt in order to preserve the veneer of affluence, by people working 2 and 3 jobs, not to live lives of luxury, but to put food on their tables, to send their kids to school properly clothed and with decent school supplies, that was being masqueraded by an ever-increasing need for at least 2 incomes per family, even though the childcare systems and family leave protections that ought to have backstopped such transformation were not in place. I was encountering men and women whose pensions had disappeared because large companies had deliberately gone into bankruptcy as a way of rescheduling their pension obligations. And in many cases, those companies were doing so with a nod and a wink from President George Bush's administration. I was encountering a poverty in which people were working for large corporations and were earning $7 an hour. And even though they were working full-time, they had no health benefits. And even though they were working full-time, many of them were still ending up on food lines. I went to a food pantry in Siskiyou County in Northern California, and I interviewed the old couple who ran that pantry, George and Billy McPherson. And one of them said to me, "The month is longer than the paycheck." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, for our neighbors, they're hardworking, and yet they do not have enough money in weeks 2 or 3 or 4 of the cycle to put food in their refrigerators. And so they come to us and we give them free food." Now, this was a story not of natural tragedy. This was a story of poverty not caused by tsunamis or hurricanes or droughts or pestilence, not by failed states. This was a poverty that was intimately linked with inequality and was intimately linked with a set of policy choices that had been made from the 1970s on in that pushed money and influence higher up the economic ladder, took money, influence, and security from people down the economic ladder. It was part of that great risk shift that Jacob Hacker was talking about. It was an inequality born of choice, not an inequality born of necessity. And the result was that at the very top of the economy, an elite was thriving in the new globalized economic reality. And at the bottom of the economy, an increasingly large well of poor people not only weren't thriving, but if you looked at their lives, they were being swept backwards. Now, before the economic crash, that looked to me quite similar to the poverty amidst affluence that was described so movingly and so angrily by Michael Harrington in his 1962 book, The Other America. A poverty amidst affluence, a poverty of the invisible in a land of plenty. Harrington had worked with people who lived in SROs. He'd worked with people who lived in shacks in Appalachia. He'd worked with kids who had malnourished, distended bellies. He'd worked with adults who had never been to a doctor. And he knew that there was poverty amidst plenty. And he also knew it wasn't being talked about. And Harrington wrote his book as a way to hold a mirror up to liberal America in the early 1960s, as a way to say to the political elite, don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. Set specific policies in place that actually will improve the lives of these men, these women, and these children, that will make them a part of the American story. And he was very successful. He shamed the political leadership into action. The war on poverty, at least in part, is a product of Michael Harrington's mirror that he holds up. And it works for 10 years. For 10 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, poverty rates go down in this country. Elderly poverty rates go down. Child poverty rates go down. Child literacy rates go up. Malnourishment goes down. By many, many measures, the war on poverty is a success. But by the 70s, as a society, we take our eye off the ball. Partly we get bored. Partly we believe in the myth that the war had failed. We believe we're throwing good tax dollars after bad. We allow a backlash to set in. And in that backlash, increasingly, we start blaming poor people for their own poverty. We start viewing it as an individual sickness rather than a societal problem. We start viewing it as something that is morally blameworthy. And as a broader community, we cease to think that we have a moral obligation to intervene. Not surprisingly, when we take our eye off the ball, poverty begins going up again. It begins becoming an omnipresent part of the American reality in the late 20th and the early 21st century. Now, all of that's before the 2008 collapse. And then comes 2008. And all of those trends are intensified. And they're all magnified by collapses in tax revenues at a state and a local level, and the resultant cuts to basic public infrastructure, from education programs through to housing programs, from mental health clinics through to drug treatment facilities. For a middle class already facing deep pressures, the recession was utterly destructive. For the working poor and the unemployed poor and the jobless poor, it was truly cataclysmic. Assets carefully, painstakingly, difficultly built up over decades were wiped out overnight. Amongst African American and Latino home-owning communities, the impact undid decades of progress toward greater economic equality. By the end of the recession, by the end of 2009, average white families' assets were 18 times that of average African American families' assets. My friend Marshall Gantz, who's a lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, describes the resultant poverty as being the miner's canary. And when he mentioned that to me, I was a bit confused. I said, well, Marshall, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, you go back 100, 150 years, before there was gas monitoring equipment, miners would take a canary bird with them down into the mines. For two reasons. Canary birds are very chatty, they chirp a lot. If they're healthy, they're chirping. Secondly, they're very, very sensitive to gas. So if you take a canary bird down with you into the mines and it's chirping away and suddenly there's silence, and you look over and the canary bird is dead, you know there's gas. And if you're a sensible miner, you get out of Dodge. You run as fast as you can to seek good, clean air. Gans said to me that's what poverty is in the 21st century. It's a sign, it's a warning sign that something is going profoundly awry. And what's gone awry is that we're beginning to tolerate and we're beginning to assume as normal, as inevitable, as somehow just part of our zeitgeist, levels of inequality that we haven't seen in this country in 100 years. We're beginning to accept as normal an economic distribution that would have shamed and shocked and embarrassed our parents, that would have shamed and shocked and embarrassed our grandparents, that would have bewildered our great-grandparents, but that would have been fairly familiar to our great-great-grandparents when they came of age and first began working a long time ago. The levels of inequality that we're now seeing are very similar to those that were present in America in the Gilded Age, or the less polite way of talking about it, during the age when the robber barons ran the country. Now, since the dog days of 2008, 2009, the broader economy has bounced back. The budget deficit's shrinking. The GDP growth numbers are pretty good. Unemployment is again falling into historically acceptable territory. And the stock market and the housing markets are both in full recovery mode. In my state, California, a deficit of tens of billions of dollars, a sea of red ink that threatened to render the Golden State completely ungovernable, has been replaced by budgets in the black, by surplus. And yet in California and in the country as a whole, the stark realities of inequality and of poverty remain. As I mentioned at the start of this speech, 50 million Americans, 1 in 6 people in this country, live in poverty. 1 in 4 kids live in poverty. And in the South, the numbers are even more stark. In Texas, which is the largest big state that voted Republican, Rick Perry, when he was running for the Republican nominee for the presidency, made a whole bunch of hay out of talking about the fact that Texas had low unemployment, and that while most states hemorrhaged jobs in 2008, 9, 10, Texas actually created jobs. And he was right. Texas created jobs in the middle of the recession. But here's the thing that Rick Perry forgot to talk about. Texas also had one of the highest poverty rates in the country. And it had the highest rate of uninsurance, of lack of access to health insurance in the country. 1 in 4 Texans had no access to health care. So how do we square this? Low unemployment and cataclysmically high levels of poverty and insecurity. Well, the only way you can square it is if you realize that the jobs that were being created were overwhelmingly low-wage, non-benefited work. They were jobs that people would work at full-time and at the end of the day still be in poverty. They were jobs that they would work at full-time, and at the end of the day, they would still have to apply for food stamps. And they would still have to put their kids onto child health insurance programs run by the state. And if they didn't qualify for food stamps, at the end of the day, despite working those jobs, as like as not, they would end up at a food pantry on weekends looking for charity foods. Now, that sort of employment model is somewhat akin to a domestic maquiladora setup. Bring us your industry, and we'll turn a blind eye if you scandalously underpay your workers and you scandalously do not provide basic benefits to your workers. It's a classic maquiladora model of employment. And one sees a similar reality in much of the South in particular. A model of economic growth disproportionately reliant on low wages, on unorganized workers essentially hired and fired at will, and at huge opportunity gaps between the wealthy and the poor, the educated and the uneducated. And not surprisingly, growing out of this, we see a myriad of depressing statistics. Now, when economists and epidemiologists and public health professionals are trying to calculate poverty, They use economic indicators, but they also use a whole lot of proxy measures that over time researchers have realized tell you a lot about poverty. One of them in America is obesity, because the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be eating bad, cheap, junky, salty, sugary foods. And when you look at the obesity data, the South has vastly disproportionate levels of obesity and resultant diseases like diabetes and heart disease than other parts of the country. In the South, residents have a lower life expectancy than other parts of the country, and for some groups, African Americans and working class whites in particular, those disparities are profound. In fact, there is one group in the country which is seeing not just stagnant life expectancy, but reversing life expectancy, and that is white high school dropouts. And that group over the last 20 years has seen something in the region of a 5-year decline in life expectancy. And that's fairly comparable to the life expectancy decline seen in Russia after the Soviet state collapsed, when they entered a period of chaos. But to be white and working class and Southern in this country is actually, at this moment in time, a sure indicator that you're likely to have a lower life expectancy than your parents' generation. Some other data, high school graduation rates. Again, in the South, there are lower high school graduation rates, and that's a proxy measure of poverty. There were lower average incomes, and finally, throughout almost every state in the South, there are higher incarceration rates. And again, incarceration, which has taken off not just in the South, but all over the country in the last 30, 35 years, is in many ways a proxy for poverty, because disproportionately the people who are incarcerated are poor and they are undereducated, many are drug addicted, and many are mentally ill. And the lower your income is, the more likely it is that if you suffer from these disabilities, mental illness, etc., the greater the likelihood you're going to get involved with the criminal justice system. Now, all of this phenomena, all of these have incredibly tangible impacts on the lives of real people, not just in the South, but all over the country. What does 21st century American-style poverty mean nationally on a daily basis? Well, for Matthew Joseph, who was a 50-something-year-old steelworker and a church deacon, who I interviewed in Stockton in the Central Valley in California, it meant that he was called into work one day, and along with a few hundred of his co-workers, he was told he no longer had a job. And he couldn't refinance his mortgage because he was living in an area where every house in the area was underwater. He said, "I went home and I curled up in a fetal position on my bed and I began to cry." And he then told me that he would go out in the mornings and he would see more of his neighbors than he'd ever previously seen because every one of his neighbors was unemployed. And he said, we saw this rash of garage sales in our suburban tract, not because people were selling off souvenirs or things they didn't need. They were selling off their life's possessions in order to try and make their next month's mortgage payment. For Gershriella Green, who I met in Los Angeles, she'd worked for years at Walmart until she injured herself. She was disabled. She was now living on a few $100s a month in disability and a few $100s in food stamps for her and her children. For her, poverty meant that she could no longer drive her kids to school. It's Los Angeles. Nobody walks. They've forgotten how to walk in Los Angeles. But she no longer even had money for the tiny amount of gas that she would need to get her kids to school. She was being given an award. She said, I had to ask my friends to help me with clothing because I didn't have any respectable clothing I could wear to the awards ceremony. East of Los Angeles, I went to a class, an AP honors class, in a school that was overwhelmingly attended by low-income, first-generation immigrant children. And I went there because a few years earlier, their English teacher, Michael Steinman, had videotaped their testimonies about how the recession was impacting their lives. And in the wake of that, when President Obama was inaugurated, a few weeks in, he came out to that school and he gave a big speech. And I wanted to see how their students' lives had changed in the years since. And I went there and I interviewed this class of students, all of whom were being tracked for college. And almost to a person, they said to me, A, that they were now going to bed hungry and they were coming to school hungry, and that the food they were getting was free lunches and breakfast from the school, but other than that, they could not afford to eat. And almost to a person, they told me that their parents had either lost their jobs or lost their homes. And many of those kids said to me that they were thinking of dropping out of school and giving up on their university aspirations and giving up on their chance for a better life so they could get any job, any dead-end job, just to keep their parents and their siblings in a house. I went to Las Vegas, to the largest high school in Las Vegas, in a poor part of town called North Las Vegas, about 3 miles from the Strip. A school called Rancho, and the principal said to me, "You need to meet our homeless counselor." And I thought, well, that's strange. Why does a high school have a full-time homeless counselor? So I met her. Her name was Angela Urquiaga. And she said to me at the start of the recession, we had about 20 homeless students. This was a school with about 2,000, 2,500 kids. And then the recession kicked in, and one after another, parents began losing their jobs. By 2009, we had about 100 homeless students. By 2011, that school had 200 homeless kids. And they were living in cars, and they were living on the street, and they were living in church basements, and they were living in garages. And she said to me, these kids have nowhere to study. They have nowhere they can call home. Is that fair? And the final person I'll introduce you to is a woman called Mary Vasquez, who works for Walmart, which you guys all know is Arkansas's greatest single gift to America, with the possible exception of Bill Clinton. Except I hope that Bill Clinton pays his staff here more than Walmart pays its staff. Mary Vasquez was 67. She'd suffered from diabetes, cancer, heart disease. She had spinal problems. She had high blood pressure. And she hobbled into our interview, and she looked to be about 85 or 90. She had this broken down, elderly face. And she said to me that she earned about $1,800, $1,900 a month for full-time work. And she showed me her pay stubs, and she was indeed correct. That was about what she was earning. And then she had taxes taken out and everything else. And by the end of the day, she didn't have enough money to buy proper food. And I said, well, Mary, what are you eating? She said, well, on a good day, I eat 88-cent TV dinners that I buy at Walmart, and on a bad day, I go to bed hungry. And Mary Vasquez was too sick to take public transport to work, and she didn't know how to drive. And so she paid, with what little money she had, she paid gas money to her neighbors to drive her to work. Now, all of these stories, all of these voices, all of these lives brought up against the cold realities of Gilded Age levels of social inequality. To me, they represent one of the great moral issues of our time. They're as important as was poverty at the onset of Johnson's War on Poverty in 1964. They're as important as were the slum living conditions portrayed by Jacob Riis in turn of the 20th century New York. They're as critical a moral issue as was the child labor of the late 19th century. I believe that, and I also believe that with will and with imagination, this is something we can and we must tackle. In my book, I detail solutions. I talk about social insurance structures that we could create to make higher education more affordable. I talk about public works programs that we could set in place so that labor markets don't collapse at the onset of a fiscal crisis. I talk about ways we can restructure the tax code so that Warren Buffett isn't paying a lower percentage of his income than are the working poor in taxes. I talk about ways we can introduce microcredit systems into low-income communities so that poor Americans aren't going to payday lenders and being charged 4% and 5% and 600% a year interest for small loans. There are all kinds of things that with the political will we could do. And many of these things are surprisingly inexpensive. That we do not do them is not because we cannot do them. It is certainly not because we cannot afford to do them. That we do not do them is because to date, the political will, the imagination, the empathy has not been there. Now, over the last couple years, we've started to see a change of focus, and it fills me with hope, because all across the country, we're starting to see people talking about poverty and about inequality as moral crises. All around the country, we're starting to see people talk about dignity and talk about the fact that the working poor should not be going to food lines after 40 hours a week of work. We're now seeing President Obama daring Congress to raise the federal minimum wage. And at the local level, where many of the most creative solutions inevitably are going to come from, at the local level, in Seattle, the mayor has now embraced a $15 an hour minimum wage proposal. In San Diego, voters are going to vote on a $13 an hour minimum wage proposal. All over the country, we're starting to have a conversation, and that is all to the good. Now, it seems to me that groups of intelligence, students and teachers, and members of the community, such as yourself, observers of public institutions, and changing patterns of community, you have all seen firsthand what truncated opportunities and collapsed dreams mean to individuals. And you also have the analytical skills to recognize what expanded opportunities and realized dreams would mean to individuals and to their communities. And I hope and I believe that in the coming years, you will use your talents and your ideals to tackle these scourges, to render real, finally, Michael Harrington's 1962 vision of an energized populace with the long-term stamina to banish mass poverty from the American landscape. And that's where I'm going to leave this. I suspect that you probably got some questions for me, and I want to leave plenty of time for the answers and for the conversation. So again, many, many thanks for this extraordinary opportunity to address you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Questions? Anybody have questions? Yes. Wait, please wait for the mic. It's coming right at you.
It's my understanding that the minimum wage reached its peak spending ability in 1968 or somewhere around that time. And it is just unconscionable to me that people are against raising the minimum wage. Can you speak to that?
I can agree with you. The idea that if we raise the minimum wage not to a level that will make people affluent, but simply to a level that provides basic economic security and stability, that somehow is going to bankrupt major corporations like McDonald's or Walmart or any of the other corporations that either pay the minimum wage or just above the minimum wage, it's a nonsense. And in the cities that have embraced higher minimum wages, cities like Albuquerque and San Francisco and Santa Monica, we haven't seen hemorrhaging jobs. Despite the fear-mongering, what it's done is stimulate local economies. And the reason for that should be fairly clear, which is that if you inject money at the bottom of the economy, that money is spent. Because it's spent by people who are desperate to be able to buy food and to be able to buy clothes and to be able to buy just the basics of life. And it has a magnifier effect. And so I think, there's obviously a level beyond which raising the minimum wage would have negative impacts. You couldn't just arbitrarily say, all right, from now on in, everybody's going to be paid $100 an hour. But you certainly can say that in an economy as wealthy as is America's, that nobody should be earning $7 an hour because it's unaffordable. You cannot live on $7 an hour, and you certainly can't if you have kids to take care of.
Anna.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Anna Applebaum. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Income inequality, social mobility, and economic insecurity are all interrelated but slightly different problems. And I'm curious if you find one of them to be the most destructive, or it's just the sort of lethal combination of all three that's led to their current crisis.
I think it's the lethal combination. But I would say that inequality and the normalization of inequality is the precursor to the others. And I think inequality, if I had to pick which one I think is most damaging, I would say inequality. And the reason for that is it undermines a sense of social compact. I don't know if everyone remembers when you're in school and you're learning maths, one of the things you learn is the Venn diagram, that point of overlap. And the Venn diagram, when you sort of think about it communally, you have people from all different walks of life with all different income levels, and some people live in cities and some in rural areas. And it's a country of 300 million. It's spread over 6 million square miles. So there's all kinds of room for disparate experience. But to function as a society, there have to be those points of overlap. If you live in a community where a CEO is paid 10 times what his or her worker is paid, 10 times is a lot, but there's still some overlap. But if you live in a community where it's perfectly normal for the CEO to earn 300 or 400 times what that worker earns, the point of overlap vanishes almost to disappearing point. The daily lives of somebody who's a multi-millionaire, well, that person is going to be living in a gated community. They're going to have privatized their educational experience for their children. They're going to have privatized their security so they don't have to rely on a local police force if their house is attacked. At every level, they will have privatized their experience. And the poor person, or maybe not the poor person, that's the wrong word, the ordinary average person is increasingly going to be living a life that they do not understand and do not empathize with. And unless you can recreate that common shared experience, the common political bonds that underpin a democracy start to break down. And one of the things that Marshall Gantz was saying to me when he was talking about this danger of inequality, he said, well, look, you can go back 2,500 years to Pericles' oration in Athens, and Pericles is aware that profound inequality is utterly destructive of the body politic. And you can look at all the great philosophers, political philosophers over history, and they've all been worried about what happens when a society ignores rampaging inequality. You could look at Tsarist Russia and the power of the incredibly wealthy magnates in late Tsarist Russia, and then look at what happened afterwards, the collapse into chaos and revolution that followed. Now, we think of ourselves as exceptional. It's part of our understanding of our country that we are always exceptional. And sometimes we are and sometimes we're not, and sometimes the exceptionality is good and sometimes it's bad. But where we are not exceptional is being able to buck that trend. If we allow inequality of the levels we're seeing now to become the norm, then we are guaranteeing political chaos and instability. All the historical evidence suggests that. And so I think that, you know, if you're asking me to hierarchicalize those three, put inequality first, because a lot of the consequences that flow out of it are going to have huge impacts if we don't get a handle on it.
Yes, ma'am, right here.
Given that some of these changes have to come through policy changes, which involves politics, which involves money, how damaging is Citizens United to being able to change what's happening now?
You know, it's a great question, and I'm asked it a lot in these lectures. And here's what I'd say. Citizens United is a reality. It's a nasty reality, and I wish it weren't the reality, but it's there, which means that for the foreseeable future, vast amounts of money will continue to be injected into the political process with the aim of skewing it, and with the aim, essentially, of jerry-rigging the game against ordinary people. So we have to find some ways around that. And I do think there are ways around it. I think it involves these kind of discussions. It involves energizing communities. It involves having conversations in workplaces, in churches, in schools, in sports arena, wherever people gather. It involves making this a part of the water cooler conversation. Now, that's not an easy challenge, but it's a doable challenge. We've done it at other moments in our history. The progressive era came out of a big money era in politics. It came about as a reaction to the power of the railways and the oil companies and various other big companies and their ability to buy politics. And when you look at the stories of corruption from 100, 120 years ago, in some ways they dwarf the stories of corruption today. You know, we think that we're in a particularly corrupt, decadent age. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. But we're certainly not the first moment in American history where big money has ruled politics. So I think there are runs around it. The other thing is, if you look at what happened in the 2010 and 2012 election cycles, it's actually fairly encouraging because the public doesn't like being told who to vote for. They don't like the Koch brothers coming in or Foster Friess or any of the other billionaires who decided to throw millions of dollars into the process, coming in and saying, well, we're throwing the money in and therefore you will vote for this candidate. When you actually look at what happened in 2012, most of the candidates that received disproportionate amounts of money didn't do very well electorally. And when you go back to 2010 in California, Meg Whitman threw in more money into a gubernatorial race than any other candidate in American history, $160 million of her own money. She got absolutely nothing for it. She was completely trounced at the polls. So I do think that we can overstate the impact of big money. And the reason I think it's important not to do that is it's disempowering. As soon as you say, oh, well, the game's up, we can't do anything, big money's got a lock on the process, it becomes self-fulfilling. But if you stand up and you say, no way, there is no way that Foster Friess is going to tell me who to vote for, and there is no way that the Koch brothers are going to tell me that I should vote for a candidate that's going to oppose a minimum wage increase for Mary Vasquez and the other people I met. Well, in that case, I think you can actually empower. It becomes an energizing, mobilizing force. So actually, maybe it's quite good having some money in the process just to mobilize ordinary, everyday people against the power of money.
Yes, you got a question? Yes, right there.
Shortly after World War II, workers were looked at as assets to companies in the United States. 75% of the durable goods produced in the world were produced by American workers. In today's world, workers are looked at not as assets, but as liabilities. What do you think contributed to that, and why the change of attitude from the people who responded to this issue in the 1960s compared to the people of today?
That's a fascinating question. And it's a sort of chicken and egg question. I think what happens is, as the economy globalizes, it becomes easier to outsource. The tax system gets reformed, so you can start sending jobs further away with no penalties. We started putting a premium on stock valuations, and it became imperative for short-term profit. And one way you can get a short-term profit is you can trim your workforce and you can introduce labor-saving techniques and so on. And the more that happened, the more workers came to be seen as expendable. I think that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was the breakdown of union influence. And it's impossible to overstate that. If you go back to the post-World War II period, for 30 years, unions grew and their impact grew. And there was an informal social compact between employers and employees that benefited everybody. Wages were increased, benefits were increased, and it was that classic Fordist model that if you paid workers enough, A, they would produce more because they'd have a stake in the company, and B, they would buy more. They'd buy more of the things you were producing. And that model created virtuous circles. And as unions were disempowered from the 70s, but especially the 80s on in, you saw a casualization of the workforce, and it became easier to push wages down instead of up, and it became easier to cut benefits instead of increase benefits. And again, that became a vicious circle, because you had a casualized labor force scrambling just to stay in place, working 2-3 jobs just to stay in place, and that sense of connection to the employer disappeared. And I think the other thing that happened is our political leadership really didn't pay attention to the issue in a way that in some other countries they did. And so we provided no disincentives to fire workers. We provided very few disincentives to renege on pension obligations. We provided very few disincentives to under-benefit employees, to not provide them with health care in particular. And you contrast that with other countries, and it's a fairly stark contrast. So if you look at Germany, which 25, 30 years ago, people kept saying, oh, it's a desperately inefficient employer system, it's a desperately inefficient model, it's hidebound by rules and regulations, why can't they be like the Americans? Well, if you look at what happened in 2007, 8, 9, America hemorrhaged jobs and Germany didn't. And one reason Germany didn't is they used their tax system very aggressively to penalize employers who laid workers off. So what they had was a share the pain model, that if they were in the middle of a recession, it was far easier, because it was not penalized, for employers to simply say, all right, we've got 100 employees, we're going to still have 100 employees next week, but you're all going to work 2 or 3 hours less this month. As opposed to saying we have 100 employees and 10 of you are going to disappear. Whereas in this country, we didn't produce any tax penalties, and so employers were given an absolutely free rein to turn their labor force into liabilities. And that's been hugely destructive. And the final thing is, partly because of all of this, we've underinvested in our workers. If you spend a lot of money training your workers, they're your asset, you want to keep them. But if you undertrain and underinvest in your workforce, they're expendable. You get rid of them, you go somewhere else, you go to another country if the labor force is cheaper there. You have no incentive to stay with your homegrown workers. And that's been a huge problem in America in the last few decades.
As one of the people who wrote on this book that it is a call to action, and Sasha, I've got to tell you, when you hear speakers, they say great speakers tell great stories, and you're one of the best storytellers I've ever heard.
Thank you.
And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a very important book about social change in the fiber and fabric of our country. I hope you'll buy it and visit with him as he signs it. Let's thank Sasha for being at the Clinton School.
Thank you.